My landlord turned my apartment into a trap. I moved into my old apartment because I needed something stable enough that I could stop thinking about where I lived and start thinking about everything else again. That was the real selling point. Not the size or the price, it's just the promise that it would be boring in the best possible way. The building sat on a narrow street lined with older trees and uneven sidewalks. It was the kind of place that had survived decades without changing much, which I interpreted as reliability. The listing photos were carefully framed, but nothing looked fake. The wear seemed honest. It showed scuffed floors, cabinets that didn't quite line up, and a bathroom that had been updated just enough to hide its age. The landlord, Mr. Hastings, showed the place himself. He spoke calmly, moved slowly, and emphasized that he preferred tenants who were low maintenance. At the time, I thought that meant respectful. My girlfriend Liliana came with me to the showing. She stood near the windows longer than she needed to and asked questions about the heating and water pressure that felt unnecessary in the moment. When Hastings answered vaguely, she didn't push. She just nodded and filed it away somewhere I didn't see. We signed the lease a week later. The first month was exactly what I had hoped for. The apartment had its quirks, but nothing felt urgent. The pipes knocked occasionally, and the radiator hissed before warming up. I told myself those sounds meant the place was alive. Liliana moved her things in slowly, like she wasn't ready to commit to the space emotionally. I teased her about it, told her she was treating the apartment like it might disappear if she trusted it too much. The second month brought colder weather and smaller inconveniences. The bathroom sink drained more slowly than it had before, and the kitchen light flickered for a few seconds before stabilizing. The heat took longer to come on in the mornings. I fixed what I could. I poured drain cleaner down the sink, replaced the bulb, and adjusted the thermostat. When the heat didn't improve, I emailed Hastings. He replied a day later, telling me the system was old but functional, and that colder nights were normal for the season. That answer satisfied me more than it should have. I wanted to believe that everything had a reasonable explanation, that this was just how old buildings behaved. By November, the apartment stayed cold even during the day. I wore socks indoors, and Liliana wore sweaters to bed. We bought heavier blankets and told ourselves it was temporary. The water pressure dropped around the same time. Showers lost their force, and the kitchen faucet sputtered and coughed before settling into a thin stream. I assumed it was seasonal. Maybe something happening elsewhere in the building. I didn't complain. December arrived and brought real cold with it. The radiators barely warmed at all now. The floors felt like they were pulling heat out of our bodies. I bought a space heater after a week of waking up stiff and shivering. The breaker tripped the first time I used it for more than an hour. Suggested calling Hastings again. I hesitated, not because I didn't want help, but because something about asking felt like giving up ground I didn't realize I was standing on. I sent another email anyway. His reply was shorter this time. He reminded me that space heaters weren't recommended and suggested I dress for winter. The bathroom developed a faint smell soon after. Not strong, just something damp and unpleasant that came and went. I scrubbed everything and aired it out. I assumed it was humidity. Then the floor near the tub started staying wet. No matter how carefully we used the bathroom, moisture lingered. The tiles felt soft underfoot in one corner, and the smell grew heavier. I emailed Hastings again, describing the issue without dramatizing it. I just asked if someone could take a look. He didn't respond. Liliana stopped using the bathroom first. She didn't say anything at first. She just started brushing her teeth in the kitchen sink and showering quickly at the gym. When I asked why, she told me the bathroom felt wrong. The ceiling above the bathroom didn't collapse, but it started sagging. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The light caught it differently one morning, and the surface looked uneven. I stood on the edge of the tub and pressed gently with my palm as it flexed. That was when the fear finally arrived, quiet and controlled, but impossible to ignore. I emailed Hastings again. I explained the sagging and the smell. I explained that something didn't feel safe. This time, he replied. He said I was likely overusing the bathroom and suggested I reduce moisture by ventilating better. We didn't have a working fan. I realized then that every response followed the same pattern: delay, deflect, minimize, and shift responsibility. Still, I didn't escalate. I told myself that landlords dealt with exaggeration all the time. That if I stayed calm and reasonable, he'd eventually act. I stopped using the bathroom entirely and sealed it off as best I could. We treated it like a closed room in a house you plan to fix someday. The smell leaked out anyway, and the water pressure dropped further. Laundry became difficult. Dishes piled up. The space heater became a necessity, not a luxury, and the breaker tripped so often that I started timing its use. Hastings sent a notice, reminding tenants to avoid overloading electrical systems. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, Liliana suggested. We talked to neighbors to see if anyone else was dealing with the same things. That felt safer than calling authorities or filing complaints. We learned quickly that we weren't alone. One neighbor mentioned heat issues that never quite got fixed. Another talked about water pressure problems that had been blamed on usage. Everyone had a story that stopped short of confrontation. Everyone sounded tired. The ceiling sag worsened after a heavy rain. A slow drip began, steady and patient, like time itself leaking into the room. I put a bucket underneath and listened to it fill overnight. I didn't sleep much. When I emailed Hastings again, his response wasn't about repairs, it was about expectations. He reminded me that tenants were responsible for keeping units in good condition, and that ongoing issues could be reviewed during lease evaluations. That was the first time I felt something close to anger. I realized then that waiting wasn't neutral. Every day, I absorbed discomfort without pushing back. The situation tilted further in his favor. The apartment deteriorated, and the blame drifted quietly toward us. And the longer we stayed quiet, the easier it became to pretend that was normal. The first thing I did differently was stop trying to make the apartment easier to live in. That sounds small, but it went against every instinct I had. For months, I had been compensating for what wasn't working. I adjusted my routines and avoided certain rooms. I timed showers, timed heat, timed electricity. I treated the apartment like a problem I could solve with discipline. Once I stopped doing that, the place revealed itself very quickly. I stopped using the space heater altogether. I stopped wiping up the moisture that crept across the bathroom floor. I stopped airing the place out to keep the smell contained. I lived in the apartment exactly as it was, without compensating for its failures. Within days, the cold became unavoidable. My hands stayed stiff, and my breath fogged faintly in the mornings. Liliana started spending more time out of the apartment, not to escape it, but to think. She said being inside it made everything feel smaller, like we were being slowly folded inward. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The way the hallway ceiling began to bow slightly near the bathroom. The way the floor sloped toward the wall, just enough to notice if you stood still. The way the pipes groaned whenever another unit used water. I didn't email Hastings right away. Instead, I started paying attention to the building itself. I watched when maintenance crews showed up for other units. I noted how quickly trash overflowed before it was addressed. I noticed which units changed tenants frequently, and which ones stayed occupied despite obvious discomfort. Hastings didn't run the building like someone who wanted it to function well. He ran it like someone who wanted it to appear functional long enough. When I finally contacted him again, I kept the message short and without urgency. I told him the bathroom was unusable, and that the lack of heat made the apartment difficult to occupy. His reply came faster than usual. He said repairs would be evaluated when feasible, and reminded me again of my responsibilities as a tenant. I didn't respond. That silence felt different than before. Before, I had been waiting. Now, I was choosing not to engage. A week later, someone knocked on our door, It wasn't Hastings. It was a man I didn't recognize, carrying a clipboard and looking uncomfortable. He glanced into the apartment and barely stepped inside. He didn't touch anything. He didn't inspect anything closely. He stayed for less than 5 minutes. Later that evening, Hastings emailed to say the unit had been assessed and that no immediate hazards were found. That was the moment something hardened in me, because now I understood the game clearly. He wasn't going to fix anything. He was going to let it degrade until it became my problem, or until I left. And if I stayed, he would use the condition of the apartment as leverage. Liliana suggested something simple after that. She suggested we stop shielding him from the consequences of his own neglect. We stopped blocking off the bathroom. We stopped placing buckets neatly. We stopped trying to keep the damage contained. The drip spread, as did the smell. Moisture crept further into the hallway. We didn't damage anything. We just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. Neighbors started noticing. People asked questions in passing. They commented on the smell in the hallway. Someone mentioned water stains on the ceiling outside our unit. Hastings sent another message about unit conditions. This time, I replied. I told him the apartment was in the condition his maintenance decisions had created. He didn't like that. A notice appeared a few days later stating that the unit would be inspected again and that failure to maintain livable conditions could result in action. I realized then that he was preparing to shift blame officially. That's when Liliana did something I hadn't expected. She contacted the renter's insurance company just to ask questions. She explained the situation calmly and hypothetically. She asked what would happen if damage from upstairs moisture rendered part of the apartment unusable. Asked how liability worked when maintenance issues went unresolved. The answers were careful but clear. Insurance companies don't like ambiguity. They like responsibility assigned properly. Hastings relied on ambiguity. The following week, a new problem emerged. Water began leaking into the unit below ours. That changed everything. The leak downstairs couldn't be ignored the way ours had been. It wasn't subtle. It showed up as a spreading stain across someone else's ceiling. And it came with urgency that didn't belong to us alone. Hastings contacted me the same day. He asked if we had noticed any unusual water usage. I told him the bathroom was unusable due to unresolved issues. Within hours, maintenance arrived again, this time with more than one person and actual tools. They cut into the ceiling. They exposed rot, soaked insulation, and old damage layered beneath new damage, like a timeline of neglect. They didn't look surprised. The bathroom was officially shut off. The hallway ceiling was opened and fans were installed. The apartment became loud and chaotic, but for the first time, it was being acknowledged. Hastings stopped messaging entirely. Instead, paperwork started appearing. Notices about temporary inconvenience. Notices about access. Notices about evaluation. I realized he was shifting strategies. Fixing the problem now didn't erase the fact that it had been allowed to happen. And now, other tenants were affected. Now insurance was involved. Liliana stayed quiet through all of this. She didn't celebrate. She said this was the most dangerous part, because people like Hastings didn't escalate emotionally. They escalated administratively. A notice arrived, stating that due to extensive repairs, continued occupancy might not be feasible, and that lease options would be reviewed. I understood what he was trying to do. He wanted us out without admitting fault. But something had shifted, because now, there were records that didn't come from us. There were work orders, there were insurance inquiries, there were complaints from other tenants. There were timelines that showed how long issues had gone unaddressed. Hastings couldn't pretend this was sudden. The building couldn't pretend it was isolated. We received another message, this one carefully worded, offering a mutual termination of the lease. No penalties, no fees, just an exit. A few months earlier, I would have taken it immediately. Now, I waited. Liliana reminded me that leverage only exists while pressure remains applied. Leaving too quickly would relieve it. So, I asked for something simple. Rent abatement for the months the apartment had been partially unusable. Hastings didn't reply for 3 days. When he did, the tone was different, but he agreed. The repairs continued, and the bathroom was rebuilt properly this time. Mold was removed, insulation was replaced, and the heat system was serviced for the entire building, not just our unit. Other tenants benefited. We moved out a month later. With our rent adjusted and our deposit returned in full, Hastings never admitted wrongdoing because for the first time, his system had worked against him instead of for him. Moving out should have felt like relief, but it didn't. Not at first. We packed slowly, like people leaving a place that might try to claim something from them if they rushed. The apartment was warmer now. Too warm, almost. The radiators worked perfectly after years of barely functioning, hissing and clanking with a kind of performative enthusiasm that felt insulting. The bathroom looked new. Fresh drywall, new tiles, and even a ceiling that didn't sag. No smell, no moisture, no trace of what it had been. That bothered me more than the damage ever had because it proved something I had suspected all along. None of this had been unavoidable. None of it had been too expensive or too complicated. It had simply been unnecessary. For Hastings to care, until it stopped being convenient not to. Liliana noticed the same thing. She said it felt like the apartment was pretending nothing had happened. Like a stage reset between acts. The rot was gone, but the memory of it lingered in the walls. In the way we still avoided stepping too hard near the bathroom, and in the way we listened for sounds that no longer meant anything. Hastings never came by during the repairs. He sent representatives and contractors. He wrote emails written in careful language that never assigned responsibility. Only logistics. The final walkthrough was the same. A third party with a checklist. We handed over the keys and left without ceremony. For a few weeks after, I tried to put the experience away. I told myself it was over. We had escaped cleanly. We had gotten our rent adjusted, our deposit back, and a quiet exit. Compared to what could have happened, it was a win. But something stayed unsettled. It was the awareness that what Hastings had done wasn't unusual. He hadn't broken into the apartment. He hadn't threatened us directly. He had simply applied pressure where he knew it would hurt and waited for us to crack. And for a long time, it had worked. That realization followed me into our new place, a smaller but better managed apartment across town. The heat worked, the water pressure was strong, and maintenance requests were answered within days instead of weeks. Everything functioned the way it was supposed to, which made the contrast impossible to ignore. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I read tenant notices more carefully. I looked up property records when I was bored. I learned which companies managed which buildings in our area, and how often they changed names. That's when Hastings' name surfaced again. Not directly, but consistently. His company appeared on multiple older buildings around the city, many of them with high tenant turnover. Online reviews painted the same picture over and over again. Cold units, slow repairs, and vague threats. None of it was illegal enough on its own, but that was the pattern. Liliana didn't encourage me to dig. She didn't discourage me either. She just said that some things stayed with you because they were meant to change how you moved forward. Not because they needed revenge. One day, a coworker mentioned he was apartment hunting and described a place that sounded familiar. Old building. Low rent. A little rough, but manageable. When he mentioned Hastings' name, my stomach tightened. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't dramatize. I just asked questions. How long had the unit been vacant? What did the lease say about maintenance? How quickly did the landlord respond? He admitted that responses were slow, but said the price made it worth it. I told him what I wished someone had told me. I explained how systems failed slowly. How neglect wasn't always obvious at first. I told him to read the lease carefully and pay attention to what wasn't guaranteed. He chose another apartment. Over the next year, Harding's buildings started showing up more frequently in city reports. Not because of me, but because the system he relied on only works as long as people keep absorbing the costs silently. So eventually, someone doesn't. I heard through a former neighbor that inspections had increased, that insurance premiums had gone up and repairs were being done proactively now, not reactively. I don't think Hastings ever knew my name mattered. That's the strange part. In his system, tenants were interchangeable. Units were numbers and complaints were noise. People left, people arrived, and the building stayed profitable as long as the margins held. I wasn't supposed to disrupt anything. I was supposed to endure quietly or disappear. Instead, I stayed just long enough to force the damage into the open, and then I left, without relieving the pressure too quickly. I let the consequences of neglect interact with the systems he depended on. I used to believe that being patient meant being responsible. Now, I understand that patience without awareness is just another resource someone else can use up. The most satisfying part of all of this isn't that Hastings paid more money or fixed his buildings. It's that his strategy stopped working the way it used to. He didn't get a dramatic downfall. He didn't lose everything. He lost efficiency. And for someone like him, that matters more than reputation. What I learned is that endurance has a cost, and you get to decide who pays it. Sometimes the most extreme, realistic victory is simply refusing to keep carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with, and letting the weight fall exactly where it belongs.